Make no assumptions. You're remarkably strong and healthy for a man of 60, the doctor told Mr. Griggs as he completed his physical exam. May I ask, what did your father die of? Oh, my father hasn't died, said Mr. Griggs. He's 94 and quite vital. Well, that's wonderful, the doctor said. And how about your grandfather? What was the cause of his death? My grandfather's also alive. He's 106 years old and in fine health. As a matter of fact, he just got married. Married, the doctor asked, stunned. Why would a 106-year-old want to get married? Did I say he wanted to get married? Age is an assumption. A lot of assumptions around age, aren't there? Well-known spiritual teacher and writer Alan Cohen tells the story of a time early in his career when he was called to do a seminar at a small Unity church in Philadelphia. His usual fee for doing a seminar of that type was 50% of the total revenue brought in. But he was afraid that this arrangement would not even be enough to cover his expenses because the church was so small, so instead he set a minimum fee of $500. A few weeks before the seminar, he received a flyer in the mail which said that the cost of the seminar that the church was going to, what the church was going to charge, was $25 instead of the usual $15 for small Unity churches. And he thought, no one's going to come to this seminar at that rate. So feeling anxious about the whole thing, he called the church a couple of weeks before the event and found out that 50 people had already signed up. He called a week before the event and was told that 75 people had already signed up. By now the trend was obvious. On the day of the seminar, 125 people packed into that tiny church. Let's see now, 125 times 25 equals $3,125. Alan said he sure did learn a lesson that day about how his preconceived notions could limit his good. So it just goes to show you, right? It's not a good idea to make assumptions about things, is it? How about how long a person can, say, lead a healthy and well and active life? How much our work is worth to people? How many people are interested in what we have to say? In fact, it's probably not a good idea to make assumptions about much of anything. So this is the third week in our series on the 5 agreements. Don Miguel Ruiz teaching based on the ancient Toltec wisdom. In week 1, we talked about the first agreement, be impeccable with your word, and learned that if our desire is to be a joyous co-creator with God, it's essential to speak with integrity. So what does it mean to speak with integrity as energy and light beings? What does that mean? It means to speak life-enhancing words of love, of peace, of wholeness, because that is the truth of who we are. In week 2, the lesson was take nothing personally. We learned that when we take another's negative opinion of us personally, we give our power away and make our happiness dependent on someone else. We also learned that when we take anything personally, it can only happen because somewhere deep down we resonate with what they said. Somewhere inside of us we believe what they said has merit or truth to it. For me, the greatest lesson of the second agreement lies in this statement. When someone slings judgment or criticism at us, they are slinging poison. But until we swallow that poison by agreeing or resonating with that judgment, it is powerless to harm us. We learned a lot from Michael Rice this week about how we tend to think that people can make us feel something, can hurt our feelings, can change our state of happiness. Don Miguel is talking about exactly the same thing in the second principle. So now we arrive at the third agreement, make no assumptions. And let's face it, making assumptions is nothing more or less than making up stories. We take our past experiences and assume the same will happen in the future. We had a bad experience in a relationship, or maybe even a few of them, and assume that relationships are very, very difficult. My story was, I'm just no good at relationships. Time goes on, and we get a little older and wider and balder, and pretty soon we're sure that even if we had the courage to try again, no one would find us attractive. Now I wonder, with that mindset, what the chances are of us ever forging a long-term relationship, meaningful relationship, with the right partner. Our stories tend to have a life of their own, don't they? And not only that, their power grows over time. So maybe we're already in relationship with a compatible partner or friend. Have you noticed that your relationship can easily become chock full of assumptions and stories? Well, I wonder if you've ever thought anything like this. If you really cared about me, you'd know what I want for Christmas. After all these years, you ought to be able to tell that I'm upset. You know how much I like you to call when you get to your hotel when you're traveling. And you didn't call and I was worried. Why does she keep doing that when she knows it drives me absolutely crazy? All assumptions. My son doesn't care much for me. He probably doesn't even think much of me because he almost never calls me. Oh, he's being really quiet. He must be mad at me. I knew you wouldn't mind if I borrowed your jacket. And I'm sure you don't mind going with me to my mother's for dinner on Sunday. On and on and on. And I ask myself, what am I doing? Why do we so often prefer to make up stories rather than simply asking a question? What's so hard about asking you if you're angry with me, or requesting that you call me when you get to your hotel, or saying what I want for Christmas, or calling my son myself if I want to talk to him? Ruiz says asking for what we want makes us feel vulnerable, and so we try to avoid it. What if the person refuses our request and we don't get what we want? Or if we have the habit of taking things personally, we might tell ourselves that someone has refused our request because they just don't care enough about us to give us what we want. We would rather make the whole thing up to hear something we're afraid to hear. It's really common to equate someone giving us what we want with how much they love us. We seem to have trouble making the distinction between compliance and love, between agreement and love. But think about it. Wouldn't our relationships be easier and freer if we all knew that it was okay to say no to our partner or our friend without them making up a big story about it? What if you could count on your partner's friend or your friend's yes to be a true indication of his or her desire and willingness to do something, rather than it coming out of being fearful of hurting your feelings or causing a rift in your relationship? Wouldn't trust grow in our relationships if we had the courage to just tell the truth and to remain curious by asking questions? I have a great story about which is a really good friend of mine. Her name was Patty, and she had been going with this guy, Bill, for 5 or 6 years. But she was unwilling to make a permanent commitment to him because she said he never told her what she meant to him. He was good to her, but because he had never passionately said the things that she wanted to hear, she just wasn't sure about the relationship. Her assumption was that since he had not said them to her, he didn't feel them. So one Valentine's Day, she and I cooked up this idea. It took a lot of courage. First of all, she made a reservation at a really expensive restaurant. Didn't wait for him to do it. She did it. And when she told him where they were going, there was a moment where there was a gulp. All right, but then he agreed, fine, let's go. And then Patty sat down and she wrote a letter to herself as though it came from him, which said all of the dear, sweet, loving things she wanted to hear. And she worked on that letter till she had it just right. Now, so they go to this lovely French restaurant, and after the waiters come and poured them an excellent glass of wine, and it's gotten still in there, Patty hands him the letter. And Bill just quietly reads the letter, but she notices there's a small smile on his face as he does so. And then she says to him, Bill, do you think you could read that letter to me? And she waited. And Bill said nothing, just looked steadily into her eyes. And then he sat his wine down, almost like it was in slow motion, and he took one of her hands in his, and he proceeded to read that letter with so much love and so much passion. Look at me. They both ended up in tears. Then he kissed her hand ever so tenderly, and he said, Patty, I'll always be grateful that you did this for me, because I didn't think I'd ever find the words to tell you how I really feel about you. Very courageous of Patty, wouldn't you say? Yes. That could have gone very differently. But even if it had, she would then have known where they stood. It takes courage to ask for what you want, but it sure does clear up a lot of confusion. Patty and Bill got married a few months later. How different might our committed relationships be if lovers were not so afraid to explore their differences before making the commitment? I don't know about you, but most of the time, I know I've done it, and I've counseled people who have done it, we sort of get swept away in the moment of a new relationship, and we get excited and passionate, and we don't want to ask any questions that might burst that bubble, right? So if we wait till we're married and have a kid before we decide to bring up the stuff, that's a problem. And you know, this happens with friends as well. You know, we form really deep friendships with people, and we just, because we like the way it feels, we avoid saying the things that we think could cause a problem. But I love this cartoon. You've probably seen it. It's a cartoon of a man down on one knee proposing to this woman, and the bubble over his head says, she thinks I'm so wonderful. And the bubble over her head said, I can change him. I think I'll just go along with this. How true is that? We think we're going to change people. It's not our business to change people. Often I hear people complain that when their partners are tired or angry or sad, they withdraw into a sort of cave. By the way, we just created a man cave on our property. So you know what they do about that? You know what they're doing while you're out in the man cave? They're making up stories. That's what they're doing. Since you're not telling me what's going on with you, I guess I'll just create a story to explain it. But once you emerge from that man cave, you have a big surprise coming for you. I have figured it all out. And within seconds, I'm going to start telling you what is going on with you. I know you've never been there with me, right? We make so many assumptions about each other. We think we know our spouse or our child or a friend or boss or parent, but we don't. We only know what we think about them. We can't know another person. We can't know what they're thinking and what's really going on with them. But this can be a hard pill to swallow. But it is important to understand that what we think about our loved ones is different from what anyone else thinks about them, and certainly different from what they think about themselves and what they're doing. Remember, this is in the unity principles. What we see is a factor of the lens we're looking through, not what we're looking at. So we go along and we pretend we really know each other because We're so eager to cross that gap between us and be free of our loneliness. We want to feel connected. But the truth is that at the purely human level, this is almost impossible. But it helps to understand that at its heart, every close relationship between us and another person is a spiritual union. Sometimes when I feel disconnected from Seth, I get worried, and I think that there's something wrong between us. And it helps me to remember that it's just quiet. It's okay. And also to remember that there's a natural ebb and flow to connection and intimacy with our friends and our loved ones. If I could be with my feelings, understand this loneliness and lack of connection I feel inside is a spiritual issue between me and my source. Perhaps if I could be with my feelings instead of trying to think my way out of them, the perceived problem would just float away. The difficulty of sitting with uncertainty and anxiety, the anxiety of unanswered questions, really hit home in my work as a business consultant too. I had an advisor whom I talked to about it, and she once said to me that the very best and wisest thing I could do for my client was to not know the solution to a problem. Boy, was that hard. My client and I both wanted to resolve the tension of not knowing. I wanted to look smart and worth the money she was paying me. And I assumed that my client would want the problem to go away as quickly as possible. But by not jumping to conclusions in my work either, not grabbing at the first thing that came up as a possibility, we had the calm to go deeper into the question. And we gave ourselves time to identify the real underlying issues and come up with solutions that would last rather than spend a lot of time and resources dealing with symptoms. Isn't that what we do most of the time, is deal with symptoms? Taking things personally and making up stories are agreements we make with each other. They are agreements not to trust, not to be curious, not to communicate honestly. And this means that this dance is always a two-way street. I have to admit an inner chuckle when someone said to me about the lesson on the second agreement the last time we did it. I sure wish my husband had been here today. He really has a problem with taking things personally. Oh, well, you've never done that, right? Now, Ruiz says that the most problematic assumption making has to do with the stories we make up about ourselves or why things have happened to us. Why is life this way for me? As far as ourselves are concerned, we either underestimate or overestimate our capabilities. When there's no way to really understand why something has happened to us. And when it seems impossible to just surrender into it, much as the situation we're talking about today, to somehow surrender to the divine, this catastrophic thing that is so upsetting to us. We want to make up stories about it. We think understanding will make it easier, and guess what? It doesn't. Marshall Rosenberg in Nonviolent Communication describes a practice called observation without judgment. And he doesn't just mean negative judgments. He meant simply observing what happened and feeling what we feel without jumping to conclusions about why it's happened or who's at fault or what needs to be done next. Sitting with our feelings is not easy to do. So instead of judging ourselves worthy or unworthy, capable or incapable, we could simply ask ourselves this: what is working for me and what isn't? What seems natural to me and what isn't? I love this story of my niece who in her 30s made her first $1 million selling for a very large corporation. And she got some big award for that. They had $1 million club. And I said to her, Colette, that's amazing. Good for you. Congratulations. She said, oh, anybody can sell. Do you think you could sell $1 million worth of copiers? No, not me either. Sadly, our questioning often leads us to find some of our talents and capabilities more worthy than others. And we overlook the talents that we should really be diving into. Another story. I have a friend named David who had this incredible singing voice. And his parents said to him, oh, you are never going to make any money singing. So David, taking this to heart, went all the way through school until he got a PhD in economics. And then he went to work for Booz Allen Hamilton in Washington, one of the most prestigious firms in D.C. And he was miserable for 20 years. He was on antidepressants. I remember one time going over to his house just because he wouldn't answer the phone, and I had to get him out of bed in the morning. He paid a terrible price for not listening to who he was and living in that out and making the assumption that there's no money in singing. Really? Right. When we tell ourselves lies about who we are so that someone we're with will find more approval for us, we abandon ourselves and create a life of turmoil. Our domestication has led us to believe that we ought to live and be a certain way. And we become miserable when we try to compare the situation in our lives, who we are, to the picture in our minds. A husband is supposed to be this way. A wife is supposed to be this way. Our kids are supposed to be healthy and obedient. Oh, God help us with that one. I'm supposed to feel happy all the time. We believe these stories, and they're usually unconscious and running in the background. We don't really know we've made them up. So the only solution can be to become more aware of what is going on in our minds. And again, that was the whole theme of Michael Rice's work all week. How do we do the work of really knowing what's going on in our minds and being able to sit with that until we get insight about what's causing it? We can learn to show up for life. I remember a therapist telling me when I first started, you are creating life in your own mind, and we're going to have to tear that down so that you can now see what's really there. How about that for a diagnosis? But it changed my life completely because I had so many assumptions from my upbringing about how the world was supposed to look and be that I couldn't even see what was right in front of my face. Well, Don Miguel again says it's all about practice. Using our own life as our classroom, making a habit of being impeccable with our words, of not taking things personally and not making assumptions, takes practice. But if we're willing to try, we can become present in the here and now with what's really going on without creating a story. I've noticed that when Sepp and I, the more we do this, the more times there are these pauses in our conversations where we're not answering one another quite so quickly. We're not coming up with answers to problems quite so quickly. It's absolutely wonderful to be free of the victim and the judge inside our own heads. Truly free to use our minds and bodies to live our own life instead of the one that someone told us we ought to live. It's truly wonderful to be free to love with our whole hearts and minds and souls, regardless of what the other person is going through or doing in the moment. Ruiz says that we all think too much. Our minds are like wild horses that we allow them to take us wherever they want to take us. On and on our minds go, creating huge dramas out of what ifs and why has this happened. When true freedom lies in living in the heart, in trusting our feelings and our intuition. Often our hearts tell us what to do or guide us in the right direction, and what do we do next? You say, well, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, so I better think of some other scenarios just in case. But trusting in life, trusting in Source, trusting in God, means that truth is coming through us at all times. Not coming from here, coming through us. Tuning in, tapping in to that truth coming through is what it's all about. And I can only imagine what life would be like if I were doing that, even 80% of the time. God bless you all.